Robert Simms, MLC, is the lead candidate for the Greens and is a sitting MLC in the Legislative Council. Thanks for joining us on Flow, Robert.
Good morning. Good to be with you.
Now, Robert, loneliness is something that some people struggled with before the pandemic, but it's been a serious problem during that. You've got a proposal to bring that into the spotlight.
Yeah, that's right. What we're proposing is that the next government create a Ministry for Loneliness and a loneliness action plan to deal with the increasing incidence of loneliness that we're seeing in South Australia. What we want this new minister to do is actually bring together different government departments, different agencies, work with business, work with community groups, to look at how we can ensure people are better connected. Because, as you say, this has been a big issue during the pandemic, but also it's a long-term social problem. There's some research that came out recently that showed that 1 out of 4 Australians experience loneliness at least 3 days a week. That's pretty significant in terms of the impact of quality of life. So it's something we need to look at.
When you talk about having a minister for that, we had a minister for mental health and I think a minister responsible for suicide prevention. You're talking about a similar focus on this specific issue?
Yeah, that's right. You're right, we do have a minister for mental health, but they've got a pretty broad remit, and sometimes if you don't have a dedicated person to look at an issue like this, to draw the connections together, things can be lost. And so the minister would also need to be responsible for a strategy which would look at the impact of government policy and legislation on loneliness and on the connections that people build between each other.
And I gather loneliness is not a sort of something that tends in a particular age demographic. It can go from the quite old to the quite young.
It can. And, it's something that I think we've all grappled with over the pandemic. I'm somebody who lives on my own and, I had COVID earlier in the year, and so I was forced to stay at home for 10 days and didn't see anybody for, a 10-day period. That's a pretty challenging thing. And as part of our new life living with the pandemic, I think lots of us are going through periods where we're either working from home at different times or we're having to quarantine or isolate. And I think that's magnifying the effects of loneliness. And so we do need to have a government response. And that's why we've put this idea forward today. And we're saying that the next government, whether that be the Labor Party or the Liberal Party, should look at this and make it happen.
Now, is this something you'll also look at regarding regional areas? That sometimes distance and its tyranny can be a contributor to loneliness?
Absolutely. And that's why, again, we need someone in this role that can bring together all these different government departments, look at the connections, whether it be, transport, health, education and so on, the different factors that can lead people to be more isolated and can contribute to loneliness.
And is it something you're hoping we'll see? What's the outcome? How do you believe you could sort of combat loneliness? What is it you'd be hoping to achieve from this strategy in terms of someone who's overcome loneliness?
Well, what you'd need to do, and certainly what's happened overseas, is you have a clear action plan that has some measurables so that you can determine how you're tracking. And that'd be a focus of any strategy is how do we measure it? How's it tracking and what are some of the different relationships with different government departments? But really, during this election campaign, I think there hasn't been much of a focus on these sorts of issues. So the Greens are putting this on the agenda today and we're saying to the major parties, look, come on board and make it happen in the new parliament. It's an idea that's been proposed in other places around the world. The UK has one. They brought it in 2018. Japan have done it recently in response to the pandemic. We don't have one here in Australia, but there is a proposal to establish a ministry like this over in Victoria. So I think it's something that makes sense.
And just lastly, you're the lead candidate for the Legislative Council in the state elections. So you'd be hoping to continue representing the Greens in the upper house.
I certainly am. So we're this election hoping to win the balance of power in our own right. We're really hopeful that we can return myself back to the Legislative Council, but it'd also be terrific to see my running mate join me, and that means we could have 3 members of the state upper house, the balance of power in our own right, and play a really significant role in shaping the agenda of the next government. That's our main campaign goal.
Robert Simms, thanks for joining us today on Flow on a topic that I guess touches a lot of us from time to time, as you say, and we'll delve into that deeper very soon. Thank you.
Thanks very much for your time.